You have killed gods, burned down entire dynasties, waded through rivers of rot without flinching, and somewhere along the way you probably stopped noticing that the character you are playing has absolutely no business being as calm about all of this as you are, and that is where this video actually begins. Before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who thinks about these games at 2 in the morning instead of sleeping, this channel exists for exactly that, so consider subscribing before we get into it, because there is a lot of ground to cover and it only gets stranger from here. Here's the thing about the Tarnished that most people gloss over. We talk about Elden Ring's protagonist the way we talk about protagonists in general, as a vessel, a blank slate, a stand-in for the player's own choices, and on the surface that reading holds up. The game barely gives you a face, it barely gives you a voice, it hands you a body, a horse, a jar of fingers to smear on your own skull, and lets you go. But underneath that blankness is a set of behaviors so consistently deranged, so completely divorced from any normal human response to horror, that if you actually stop and catalog what the Tarnished does across a single playthrough, you start to wonder whether blank slate was ever the right description at all. Maybe what we've been playing this whole time isn't an empty vessel. Maybe it's something closer to a person who has been broken in a very specific way, and who has adapted to that brokenness so completely that the horror doesn't register anymore. Let's start with the obvious one, the one everybody jokes about but rarely sits with. The Tarnished dies constantly. Not dies in the sense of losing a life and respawning at a checkpoint the way we wave off in most games. Dies in the sense that the fiction itself insists you are dying, actually and completely, over and over, sometimes dozens of times against the same boss, and each time you are dragged back through whatever passes for the space between life and death and the lands between, and each time you get up and walk right back into the same fight. Think about what that would actually mean if it happened to a person. Not a video game character with 3 lives and a continue screen, but an actual mind experiencing actual death, again and again, at the hands of the same towering nightmare, with no guarantee that this attempt will go any differently than the last 19. Most human minds do not survive that kind of repetition intact. Trauma research on survivors of near-death experiences, car crashes, drownings, cardiac arrests, consistently shows lasting psychological aftershocks from a single brush with death. A single one. The Tarnished racks up hundreds, maybe thousands, over the course of a single playthrough, and shows no outward sign of it at all. No hesitation at the fog gate, no trembling hand on the hilt. If anything, the deaths seem to sand down the fear rather than build it up, and that alone should tell you something is deeply wrong with how this character's mind is put together. And this is where the game's own lore actually backs up what would otherwise just be a joke about respawning. The Tarnished isn't dying and respawning because of some abstract game mechanic floating outside the fiction. The fiction has an answer for why you get back up, and the answer is the Rune of Death, or rather the absence of it. Marika shattered the Rune of Death and scattered it across the world specifically, so that death would stop functioning properly, so that certain beings, the Tarnished among them, would be caught in a loop of dying without the finality that death is supposed to carry. This isn't a gameplay convenience the story politely ignores. It's baked directly into the metaphysics of the setting. You are, canonically, a being for whom death has been broken. And a being for whom death has been broken is not a being who should be expected to behave the way a normal person behaves. We tend to treat that detail as world-building flavor. A clever explanation for why you don't get a game over screen, and then we move on to the next boss without asking what it would actually feel like to be the thing that's happening to. Picture it from the inside for a second, because the game never asks you to, and that omission is itself worth noticing. You are struck down by a colossal, screaming, half-formed abomination. You feel, if feel is even the right word anymore, your body give out. And then there is nothing, or something adjacent to nothing, some liminal gray non-space the game represents as a loading screen and a flash of light, and then you are standing again at a site of grace, fully intact, weapon in hand, with the memory of your own death fully retained, not repressed, not fragmented. Retained clearly enough that you walk back toward the same fog gate with what looks, mechanically, like confidence. A person who remembers dying and walks calmly back toward the thing that killed them is not behaving like someone who fears death. They are behaving like someone for whom death has stopped being the thing it's supposed to be. And adapting to that reality would require a fairly profound restructuring of whatever passes for sanity in the first place. There's a detail worth sitting with here, and it's one the game buries in item descriptions rather than dialogue, which is on brand for From Software but still worth pulling out into the light. The Tarnished were not always broken this way. Before the Shattering, before Marika fractured the Elden Ring and scattered its runes across the lands between, the Tarnished were exiles, people who had lost their grace, banished from the lands between for reasons the game never fully spells out, sent across the sea to lands unknown, stripped of the guidance of the Erd Tree. That's the starting condition. Exile, loss, banishment from the only spiritual framework these people would have known. And then, centuries later, the Shattering happens, the Erd Tree's light flickers, and suddenly these same exiles are being called back, drawn by whatever compulsion the Golden Order or its enemies have wired into them, to fight for the throne they were once cast out from ever approaching. So before a single boss fight, before a single death, the Tarnished's baseline psychological state is already exile and abandonment. You are playing someone who was thrown away once already, and who is now returning to the site of that rejection because some external force has yanked the leash. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how casually the game treats resurrection as a resource. And notice that resources, by definition, are things you're expected to use freely, rather than ration out of some instinct for self-preservation. Flasks of crimson tears exist explicitly to be drained and refilled at will. Runes exist to be lost on death and recovered, or not, by walking back through the exact place you died, bloodstain and all. Retrieving your own accumulated power from the ground like picking up a dropped set of keys. The game does not treat your death as a narrative event. It treats it as an inventory transaction. And you, the player, absorb that framing so completely that within the first hour of any playthrough you stop flinching at your own death entirely. That adaptation happens fast. Faster than it should, if you think about what's actually being adapted to. Let's talk about the flask itself for a second, because the mechanism of resurrection matters as much as the frequency. The flask of crimson tears doesn't just heal wounds. Its lore ties it to the tears of grace-touched maidens, to a kind of borrowed divine vitality that lets a body that has no business surviving keep surviving anyway. You are drinking, repeatedly, a substance derived from beings connected to the Erd Tree's power, in order to patch a body that keeps getting torn open by giants and dragons, and worse. Stop and imagine explaining that sentence to someone who has never played the game. You drink liquid tears harvested from sanctified women in order to survive being disemboweled by a dragon, and then you do it again 15 minutes later against a different dragon, and this is treated, by the fiction and by you, as completely unremarkable. That unremarkable quality is the whole point. It's not that the Tarnished is unaware of how strange their existence is. It's that the strangeness has been normalized into a routine, the way anything horrifying becomes mundane once you do it enough times. Now let's move to the killing. Because if the dying is disturbing in a passive sense, the killing is disturbing in an active one. And the Tarnished does an enormous amount of it without any apparent selectivity at all. Over the course of a full playthrough you will kill, conservatively, several thousand distinct enemies. Soldiers who are simply guarding a road. Farmers turned feral by scarlet rot who never asked to be infected. Grieving mothers wandering ruins in search of children who are never coming back. Small animals. Large animals. Things that used to be animals. Things that used to be human and are trying, in whatever broken way is left to them, to still act human. Right up until you cut them down for the runes in their pocket. The game rarely stops to ask you to reflect on any of this. It hands you experience points shaped like a currency and moves on. But a person, an actual person, not a character sprite, who could walk through that volume of death without any accumulating horror, any hesitation, any moment of simply not being able to raise the weapon again, is not a psychologically ordinary person. They are someone for whom killing has become procedural, frictionless, a means to an end so thoroughly internalized that the humanity or non-humanity of the target barely registers as a variable in the decision. There's a particularly sharp version of this if you think about the invaders, other Tarnished, summoned into your world by the game's online systems, who exist for the sole purpose of trying to kill you, and whom you are expected to kill first if you want to survive the encounter. These are, within the fiction, exactly the same kind of being you are. Exiles, death broken, chasing the same throne, and you cut them down without a flicker of recognition, the same way you'd cut down a wolf or a soldier, because in the moment the fiction of shared identity means nothing next to the mechanical fact that they are trying to end your run. That's not a small thing to gloss over. You are killing versions of yourself essentially over and over, and the game frames it as sport. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how the game handles the Tarnished's memory, and notice that memory loss isn't presented as a mystery to be solved so much as a baseline condition you're simply expected to accept and move past. You begin the game with no memory of who you were before exile. None. Not a fragmented memory. Not a suppressed trauma slowly resurfacing through therapy adjacent gameplay mechanics the way some other games handle amnesia protagonists. Just a flat, total blank. A character who exists entirely in the present tense because there is no accessible past to draw from. Ronnie, in one of the game's more pointed pieces of dialogue, essentially confirms that this blankness is functional rather than incidental. The Greater Will chose Tarnished specifically because their emptiness made them suitable vessels, malleable enough to be pointed at a goal without the baggage of a fully formed self getting in the way. You are not just someone who forgot their past. You are someone whose past was in some sense stripped out on purpose, because a person with intact memories and an intact identity might have opinions about being used as a weapon, and opinions are inconvenient for whatever's doing the using. Sit with that for a moment, because it reframes everything else in the game. Every choice you make is the Tarnished, which god to serve, which ending to pursue, which factions to help or betray, is being made by someone with no continuous sense of self prior to the game's opening minutes. There is no childhood to draw values from, no family loyalty pulling against a quest objective, no formative trauma shaping your risk tolerance the way it would for basically anyone in the real world. Whatever personality the Tarnished appears to have is being constructed in real time, moment to moment, entirely out of the actions you take during the playthrough itself, which means the psychological profile we're building in this video is, in a very real sense, a profile of pure behavior with no interior history to explain it. That's rare. Most fictional characters, even blank slate ones, have some backstory scaffolding holding their choices together. The Tarnished has almost none, and what little it has is designed to be irrelevant to who you become. This is also where the meta layer of all this gets hard to ignore, because you, the person holding the controller, are the ones supplying the missing psychology. The game doesn't just tell you the Tarnished is empty, it makes you the thing filling the emptiness, turn by turn, decision by decision, without ever asking whether the decisions you're making on this character's behalf are decisions a stable, unbroken mind would make. You choose to walk toward the fire giant a fourth time after 3 brutal deaths. You choose to summon spirit ashes made from the crushed remains of long-dead creatures and set them loose as disposable meat shields. You choose eventually to burn down the only tree in the world capable of granting a kind of eternal life, or to become a god yourself, or to shatter the order of the universe entirely, all because a talking finger in a jar told you it would be a good idea. None of these are choices a person entering the situation cold, with a fully intact sense of self-preservation and ethical hesitation, tends to make without at least pausing. But you don't pause. You've been trained not to. By hundreds of prior deaths that taught you death doesn't really cost anything. By an amnesiac protagonist with no internal resistance to override. And by a game genre that has spent over a decade teaching you that hesitation is the thing that gets you killed for real. Let's talk about the finger, because I said the talking finger in a jar and moved right past it. And that sentence deserves at least a full minute of unpacking on its own. Very early in the game, the Tarnished acquires what's called a finger reader, or is directed to speak with entities embedded in severed, disembodied fingers preserved in jars. The 2 fingers themselves, servants of the Greater Will who communicate with you through a grotesque, writhing hand-shaped mass that speaks in the game's opening cinematic and periodically thereafter. You are, from the outset, taking spiritual instruction from a dismembered body part, not a metaphorical one. An actual rendered animated collection of severed digits that pulses and gestures and issues divine guidance. And rather than recoiling from this, the Tarnished kneels, repeatedly returns to it, treats its instructions as legitimate spiritual authority worth organizing an entire military campaign around. If you saw a person in real life kneeling in front of a jar of fingers and taking life advice from it, your first instinct would not be wise adventurer receiving divine counsel. Your first instinct would be to call someone. But because the game frames it with enough atmosphere and enough painterly gothic dread, we accept it as world lore, rather than as the fairly stark symptom it would represent in an actual human mind. A person so detached from ordinary reality testing that grotesque, disembodied authority figures read as trustworthy, simply because they claim spiritual legitimacy. And then there's Torrent, the spectral horse, who deserves his own moment here. Because the relationship between the Tarnished and their mount is, when you actually look at it, one of the stranger bonds in the entire game. Torrent isn't a normal horse. He's explicitly described as a creature belonging to the space between life and death, capable of double jumping across chasms that should be physically impossible, capable of being resurrected right alongside you if he falls in battle, tied to your own fate through some grace-adjacent bond that the game never fully explains, but clearly wants you to feel as intimate. You ride a half-spectral steed who dies and returns exactly as casually as you do, into combat against things 20 times his size, and you do this so often that by the midpoint of most playthroughs, summoning Torrent has become as reflexive as breathing. There is no in-fiction moment where the Tarnished stops and marvels at the fact that their horse can die and come back too. It's just Tuesday. It's just how travel works now. The normalization of a resurrecting horse is, weirdly, one of the clearest signs of how thoroughly the Tarnished baseline has shifted away from anything resembling ordinary human expectation. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how the game handles grafting and incarnation more broadly, and notice that body horror in the lands between isn't confined to enemies. It's something the player character is fully complicit in engaging with, over and over, as a matter of routine character progression. Consider the Godskin Apostles, whose flesh has been transformed into something between cloth and living tissue, or the various Omen, born with horns and grotesque features, and locked away by their own families out of shame. Or the countless grafted knights, whose bodies have been fused with extra limbs and weapons in horrifying combinations. The Tarnished encounters all of this not as isolated shock moments, but as a continuous background hum of the setting, and more than that, actively participates in a version of the same logic, smearing crushed fingers across their own body to trigger furl-calling finger remedies. Absorbing the great runes of defeated demigods directly into their own physiology, letting their own body become a kind of vessel or repository for other beings' power. You are not a passive observer of body horror in this world. You are gradually becoming a practitioner of it, and the game lets that transformation happen so gradually that most players never clock the exact moment their character stopped being merely someone who witnesses grotesque transformation and became someone actively engaging in a milder version of the same practice. There's also the matter of the Maiden, and this one tends to get flattened into a cute companion story beat, rather than examined for what it actually implies about the Tarnished psychology. Early in the game, you're paired with a finger maiden, Melina, in the base game's most common path, who travels with you, empowers your progress by literally granting you levels in exchange for runes, and whose entire relationship with you is built on an explicit, stated transaction. She will help you reach the Erd Tree, and in exchange, at the end, she asks that you burn her, using her body as kindling to set the Erd Tree alight. The Tarnished's response to being told, essentially from your very first meeting, that your primary companion's arc ends in her being immolated at your hands. Willingly, yes, and framed as her own choice, but still, is to simply keep traveling with her, keep accepting the levels, keep letting the relationship deepen across dozens of hours, all while that ending sits there, disclosed and agreed to, waiting, a person capable of forming what looks, mechanically and narratively, like genuine attachment to a companion, while simultaneously proceeding calmly toward a future in which that companion burns because of a bargain struck in the first 10 minutes, is a person operating with a very particular kind of emotional compartmentalization. Not necessarily cruelty, something closer to a mind that has learned to hold horror and affection in the same hand without either one displacing the other. Because displacement would mean stopping, and stopping was never really on the table. Now here's where I want to make an editorial choice clear, because it shapes everything from this point forward in the video. I'm not going to treat the Tarnished as secretly a serial killer as the thesis, because that reading is too easy and honestly a little lazy. It flattens a genuinely interesting psychological puzzle into a shock value punchline. What I want to do instead is treat the Tarnished the way a clinician might treat a case study. Not as evil, not as monstrous in some cartoonish sense, but as a mind shaped by conditions so extreme that ordinary categories of sane and insane stop being useful descriptors, and something closer to adapted to an impossible situation in a way that looks alarming from outside it becomes the more honest frame. That's the lens for the rest of this. With that lens in place, let's talk about Frenzied Flame, because it's the game's most explicit acknowledgement that madness is a live possibility for the Tarnished, not just a metaphor we're projecting onto them from outside. The Flame of Frenzy is one of the game's optional endings, tied to the Three Fingers, a being even the Greater Will's own servants regard with dread. And pursuing this path means the Tarnished willingly submits to a corrupting madness that manifests, quite literally, as an eye burning open in your character's forehead. Characters throughout the game who brush against this flame: Hyetta. Shabriri's followers, the poor souls scattered across Limgrave and beyond, babbling about seeing a red-hued vision, are consistently depicted as unraveling, losing coherence, losing the thread of who they were. And the game offers this ending as a legitimate, achievable path, one plenty of players pursue purely because the resulting cutscene is visually spectacular. Think about that for a second. The game has an entire, explicit, textually confirmed madness ending, complete with visible symptoms, degrading dialogue from those infected, and a final cinematic depicting total apocalyptic frenzy. And it is entirely possible for a player to walk that path with no more emotional weight than choosing a different piece of armor. The fact that Frenzied Flame exists as content proves the developers understood madness was a real, mechanically supported outcome for this character. The fact that most players treat it as just another ending to collect proves how little friction there is between sane protagonist and protagonist actively embracing apocalyptic madness in the actual moment-to-moment experience of playing. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how many of the demigods the Tarnished fights are, in some distorted sense, funhouse mirrors of the Tarnished's own condition. And notice that the game seems to want you to recognize the reflection even as your character shows no sign of recognizing it themselves. Millennia is a warrior who has spent her entire life fighting a losing battle against an internal rot she cannot cure, using her own Scarlet Ionia as both weapon and curse, absorbing life force from her enemies just to keep functioning. Not unlike a Tarnished, who absorbs runes from the Fallen just to keep leveling up, just to keep functioning against odds that should be insurmountable. Radon has been driven half mad by Millennia's rot and by the burden of Radon's festival, holding back the stars themselves through sheer stubborn will. A demigod essentially fighting his own decay to a standstill, the same way the Tarnished fights death to a standstill through the broken rune of death. Mog has embraced an Omen bloodline that made him an outcast from birth and has built an entire twisted theology and kingdom out of that rejection, not unlike a Tarnished built out of exile who returns to reclaim the throne that exiled them. Over and over, the demigods the game asks you to kill are demigods dealing, in exaggerated form, with versions of the same core wound the Tarnished carries: rejection, decay, an impossible burden, a body or mind pushed past what it should be able to sustain. You are not just killing obstacles, you are killing distorted mirrors of yourself, one after another, and the game never once has your character pause to notice the resemblance, which either means the Tarnished genuinely doesn't see it, or sees it and has learned not to let seeing it change anything. Let's step back into the meta layer here, because there's a version of this argument that lives entirely inside the fiction, and there's a version that lives in the actual room you're sitting in while you play. Every single behavior we've cataloged so far, the repeated deaths, the compartmentalized grief, the frictionless killing, the willingness to take orders from a jar of fingers, these aren't just things that happen to a fictional character. They're things you, specifically, are enacting turn by turn through inputs on a controller or keyboard, and the game is quietly counting on the fact that you won't experience most of it as strange, because you've been trained by the medium itself to treat these as normal mechanics rather than horrifying events. When you die to Millennia for the 40th time and immediately respawn and walk back toward the fog gate without a second thought, you are performing, in miniature, exactly the psychological adaptation we've been describing in the Tarnished. The game isn't just depicting a mind that's been broken and rebuilt around repeated death and compartmentalized horror. It's inducing something structurally similar in you, the player, for the several dozen hours it takes to finish it, and then asking you to walk away from that state as easily as your character would. Let's talk about Spirit Ashes for a moment, because this is another mechanic that gets treated as pure gameplay convenience and almost never examined for what it implies. Spirit Ashes are, within the fiction, the crushed and preserved remains of once living creatures, some of them people, some of them beasts, some of them things stranger than either, that can be summoned as temporary combat allies, sacrificed effectively as distraction and damage soak, and then simply dismissed once the fight ends or once they're killed a second time. You are, quite literally, carrying around a bag of ground-up corpses and deploying them as disposable soldiers whenever a fight gets difficult. Some of these ashes have names, backstories, voice lines. Mimic Tear, one of the most popular ashes in the entire game, is explicitly the crushed remnant of a being that could take on the exact appearance and moveset of the summoner, which means when you summon it, you are watching a duplicate of your own character, your own death broken, memory erased, exile-turned-conqueror self, fight alongside you, made from the crushed remains of some other creature entirely. There's something close to recursive horror in that, if you let yourself sit with it, an amnesiac killing machine, summoning a false copy of itself made from ground bone to help it kill something else, without a flicker of the uncanny registering on screen. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how the Tarnished interacts with Scarlet Rot and the various plagues scattered across the lands between, and notice how quickly proximity to horrifying decay becomes just another environmental hazard to manage rather than something worth a reaction. Caelid, the rot-consumed region roughly a third of the way through most playthroughs, is depicted with some of the most viscerally disturbing environmental design in the entire game. Red skies, screaming half-rotted dogs, entire villages consumed by fungal decay, the remains of a once thriving Radon's Redmane army left twisted and howling across the dunes. The Tarnished's practical response to entering this space is to check their poison resistance stat and maybe pack an extra rot cleansing item. That's it. That's the full extent of the reaction. A location explicitly designed to horrify. One that even other characters in the game refer to with dread, warning you away from it, describing it as cursed. Gets processed by the Tarnished as a resource management puzzle. Bring the right flask. Watch the meter, move on. If you saw a person walk through an actual landscape of screaming rot-consumed animals and mutilated corpses with that same flat procedural calm, checking their supplies rather than their emotional state, you would not describe that person as brave. You would describe them as someone whose capacity to register horror has been damaged in some fundamental way. There's a version of this argument that applies just as sharply to the in-game choices, and I want to walk through what success actually looks like for the Tarnished, because even the best case outcomes involve decisions that would read as monstrous from almost any other lens. Take the most straightforward ending, the one most new players stumble into first, becoming Elden Lord by restoring the Elden Ring under the Golden Order, more or less continuing Marika's original project. To get there, you've spent the entire game killing every other claimant to that same throne, including demigods who, whatever their individual sins, were in some cases trying to fix a broken world in their own flawed way. You've burned the Erd Tree using the body of a companion who trusted you. You've likely worked with, then discarded, characters like the Two Fingers or Enya once their usefulness ran out. And your reward, at the very end, is to sit on a throne built from all of that. Restoring more or less the exact system of divine authoritarian rule that caused the shattering in the first place, with yourself now installed at its center. That's not villainy in the cartoonish sense, it's something more unsettling. A mind so thoroughly reshaped by exile, death, and manipulation that restore the same broken hierarchy, but with me on top reads as a satisfying, heroic conclusion rather than a repetition of the exact failure that started the whole catastrophe. Even the more sympathetic endings carry this same undertone if you look closely. The ending where you become Lord of Frenzied Flame requires embracing total apocalyptic madness, and per its own text and imagery, effectively ending the world as anyone knows it. And yet a meaningful percentage of players choose this ending specifically because the visuals are striking, not because they've reckoned with what it would mean for their character to actually want that outcome. The Age of Stars ending, tied to Ranni, involves siding with a demigod who orchestrated the death of her own mother figure and the destruction of an entire royal line as a calculated first move in a decades-long plan, and the Tarnished role in that ending is essentially to serve as the enforcement arm of someone else's cold, patient, multi-generational scheme, which, again, the game frames as one of the more romantic or desirable outcomes, complete with a tender marriage-adjacent scene under the stars. Nearly every ending available to the Tarnished asks you to either perpetuate a cycle of divine violence, submit to a controlled madness, or become the instrument of someone else's long game, and the game presents all of these as reasonably happy conclusions. Worth pursuing, worth feeling good about reaching. That's not a flaw in the writing. That's the writing doing exactly what it set out to do, showing you a mind so thoroughly conditioned by its journey that even the good endings are structurally just different flavors of the same unresolved trauma repeating itself with a new coat of paint. It's worth pausing here to compare the Tarnished against From Software's earlier protagonists, because the studio has told some version of this story before, and the differences are instructive. The chosen undead in the original Dark Souls is structurally a similar figure, cursed, resurrecting, tasked with linking a fading flame to prolong an age that may not deserve prolonging. The Ashen One in Dark Souls 3 is even more explicit about the horror of repetition, literally an undead pulled from the grave specifically because they're a failed Lord of Cinder, already a walking symbol of a cycle that keeps producing broken results and getting reused anyway. Both of those games flirt with the same ideas we've been discussing, but there's a difference in degree that matters. Those earlier protagonists exist in worlds that are visibly, openly exhausted. Bonfires are the literal last embers of a dying age, and the tone of every NPC interaction communicates weariness, entropy, endings. The horror of endless resurrection in Dark Souls is thematically loud. It's baked into the atmosphere of every zone. Elden Ring, by contrast, gives you a vast, gorgeous, open world full of golden light and sweeping vistas, populated with a Tarnished who moves through it with an openness and vigor that doesn't match the metaphysical horror underneath. The dissonance is sharper here, specifically, because the game refuses to let the world itself constantly remind you how wrong all of this is. Dark Souls wears its despair on its sleeve. Elden Ring hides its despair inside beautiful lighting, and that concealment is exactly why the Tarnished psychology reads as more unsettling once you actually stop and catalog it, rather than less. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Covenant and faction systems scattered throughout the lands between. And notice how easily the Tarnished slides between mutually hostile ideological camps without apparent internal conflict. You can serve the Golden Order's remnants in one sequence, aid the Frenzied Flames followers in another, assist Ranni's occult conspiracy against the very order she once served, and lend a hand to the Volcano Manor's assassins, who operate entirely outside any of those systems. Sometimes within the same single playthrough depending on how completionist you're feeling. Each of these factions holds genuinely incompatible worldviews about what the lands between should become, and the Tarnished, functionally, treats each one as a quest hub rather than a binding ideological commitment, extracting whatever items or advantages a given storyline offers before moving on to the next, often contradictory, arrangement. A person with a stable, coherent set of values does not typically assist a Divine Order's crusade in the morning and aid an anti-order occult conspiracy against that same crusade by the afternoon without so much as an internal note of dissonance. But the Tarnished does exactly that, over and over, because, and this loops back to the amnesia point from earlier, there was never a stable value system there to begin with. What looks like flexibility is closer to the absence of a fixed self, capable of holding a position long enough for contradiction to register as uncomfortable. Let's sit with the grinding for a moment, because this is one of those behaviors so baked into how these games get played that almost nobody clocks it as strange, and yet described plainly. It's one of the more disturbing habits in the entire Tarnished behavioral profile. When a boss proves too difficult, a large fraction of players, not a small minority, a genuinely large fraction, will leave the boss arena, walk back to an earlier, weaker area of the map, and deliberately, repeatedly kill dozens or hundreds of weaker enemies purely to accumulate runes and increase their own power before returning to try the boss again. Consider what that actually is, stripped of the gamified framing. A person who cannot defeat a specific powerful opponent responds not by developing better technique, not by seeking allies, not by finding another path entirely, but by embarking on a structured campaign of mass killing against comparatively defenseless targets, purely as a means of self-improvement through accumulated violence, before returning to the original confrontation stronger. That is essentially the psychological structure of a small-scale campaign of premeditated slaughter undertaken for the specific purpose of becoming more lethal. We call it grinding and treat it as a mundane, almost administrative activity, a chore between the real content, and that reframing. Violence as chore, violence as bookkeeping, might be the single clearest piece of evidence in this entire video for how thoroughly the game and the genre around it has recalibrated what counts as a normal response to difficulty. There's a smaller, quieter piece of evidence worth mentioning here too, tucked into how the game handles the Tarnished's own bodily upgrades, versus how it frames similar upgrades in its villains. When Godric the Grafted stitches the arms of defeated enemies onto his own body to increase his strength, the game frames this as monstrous, tragic, a sign of a once noble demigod's decline into something desperate and grotesque, and most players find him genuinely unsettling to fight for exactly that reason. But the Tarnished does a structurally similar thing constantly, just through different systems, absorbing great runes directly into their body to gain the powers of demigods they've killed. permanently altering their own physiology through remembrances and incantations derived from the bodies and souls of slain divine beings, becoming, piece by piece, an accumulation of borrowed power stripped from the corpses of others. The game never asks you to find your own character grotesque for this. It's framed as growth, as reward, as the natural shape of progression. Godric grafting is body horror. The Tarnished absorbing a great rune is a stat screen updating. The mechanism isn't meaningfully different, only the framing is, and the framing exists specifically to keep you from noticing that your own character's methods of getting stronger rhyme uncomfortably with the villain you were just asked to be horrified by 2 hours earlier. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Roundtable Hold, the game's central hub area, and notice how strange it is that this space functions, narratively and mechanically, as something like a safe house or home base, populated by a rotating cast of NPCs the Tarnished can return to, talk with, trade with, and gradually build something resembling relationships with, even while every single one of those relationships is built on borrowed time and eventual departure or death. Thea, the deathbed companion, offers something close to physical comfort and emotional intimacy in a space defined mostly by cold stone and distant fires, and her storyline, depending on the choices you make, can end in her transformation into something monstrous, or her quiet, unresolved absence. Hyetta pursues a fractured, obsessive spiritual quest tied to frenzied flame that the Tarnished can either encourage or ignore, and either path tends to end badly for her. D. Blod, Iron Fist Alexander. Nearly every recurring NPC the Tarnished builds any rapport with across the Roundtable Hold or the wider map eventually dies, disappears, goes mad, or turns hostile, frequently as a direct or indirect consequence of choices the Tarnished made or failed to make along the way. And the Tarnished's response to this pattern, playthrough after playthrough, questline after questline, is to keep forming these attachments anyway. Keep returning to the hearth. Keep trading pleasantries with people whose narrative arcs are visibly, structurally built toward tragedy. That's not naivety, not after the third or fourth time it happens in a single run. That's closer to a mind that has learned to invest in connection anyway, fully aware of how these things tend to end, because the alternative, closing off entirely, would mean giving up the last fragile thread of something resembling normal human relating that this broken memory erased. Death-adapted person has left. There's a specific and often overlooked detail buried in how many of these NPC storylines the Tarnished can, through action or more commonly inaction, directly cause to turn out worse. Failing to progress certain quest lines in time doesn't just mean missing content, it means characters like Ranni's questline companions, or various side figures scattered through Limgrave and Liurnia can end up dead, insane, or transformed into something worse specifically because the Tarnished was elsewhere, pursuing some other objective, when the timing window that would have saved them quietly closed. The game rarely announces when this happens. There's no failure state screen, no explicit acknowledgement that your inattention just cost someone their life or their sanity. You simply return to an area later and find a corpse, or an empty room, or a changed dialogue tree, and the implication settles in only after the fact, if it settles in at all. A protagonist who can, through simple distraction or misplaced priorities, indirectly cause a string of deaths across the map without the game forcing a reckoning for any of them, and who then continues on toward the next objective without evident disruption to their own functioning, is displaying exactly the kind of blunted responsiveness to consequence that shows up in real psychological literature around chronic, repeated exposure to loss, the capacity to notice, to register, and then to compartmentalize and continue, because continuing is the only mode left that still works. Let's talk about the bloodstains, because this is a small mechanical detail that carries an outsized amount of implication once you actually think about what it represents. Scattered across the lands between are glowing red markers left at the exact spot where other players, real people, playing their own separate copies of the game, died. Approach one and you can watch a translucent phantom replay of their death, silently, on loop, forever, a looping ghost of someone else's failure rendered as environmental decoration. The Tarnished walks past hundreds of these over a full playthrough, pauses sometimes out of simple curiosity to watch a stranger's death play out in miniature, and then continues on without any apparent disturbance. Think about the layered strangeness of that for a second. You are watching literal death reenactments, scattered like breadcrumbs across a landscape already saturated with actual corpses, actual grief, actual apocalyptic decay, and the tone with which the game invites you to engage with this feature is closer to curiosity than horror. It's presented as a gameplay hint system, a way to learn where danger might lurk based on where other people died. The framing device, turning death into environmental information design, is such a complete inversion of how death usually functions in storytelling that it barely registers as strange anymore. And that's worth pausing on, because the same inversion applies to how the Tarnished processes their own repeated deaths throughout the game. Now here's where the meta layer gets sharper still, because Elden Ring, like the rest of From Software's catalog, supports New Game Plus. And New Game Plus is worth examining specifically because of what it asks the Tarnished, and you, to do once the story has technically already ended. After defeating the final boss and watching one of the game's endings play out, the option exists to begin the entire journey again, from the very start, retaining your levels and equipment, but resetting the entire narrative, the entire map, every NPC interaction, every quest line, back to its original state. The Tarnished, having just achieved whatever cosmic transformation or apocalyptic conclusion the ending granted, becoming a god, embracing madness, ushering in an age of stars, simply starts over, walks back through the same tutorial cave, meets the same dying soldier, kneels before the same jar of fingers, again, as though the previous ending never happened, as though godhood or madness or cosmic transformation was simply a phase to be discarded the moment a new loop begins. Some players do this 7, 8, a dozen times across a single character, chasing achievement completion or just the pure mechanical satisfaction of replaying a well-built combat loop. Strip away the gaming context entirely, and what you're describing is a being who has, multiple times, achieved what should be a final world-altering transformation, and then voluntarily walked back into the exact conditions of their own original trauma to do it all over again. Apparently without any of the wisdom, exhaustion, or changed perspective that repeated experience should confer. That's not resilience. That's something closer to a loop with no exit condition. And the unsettling part is how naturally, how eagerly, both the Tarnished and the player embrace re-entering it. There's also something worth noting about how the Tarnished handles conversation during active combat, because it's one of those tiny details that becomes deeply strange the moment you actually picture it happening to a real person. A number of bosses and enemies throughout the lands between speak mid-fight, taunting, mourning, praying, sometimes genuinely pleading, and the Tarnished's mechanical response to hearing another being cry out in grief or desperation while actively trying to kill you is to continue attacking, without pause, without any dialogue option to respond, without even a flicker of acknowledgement beyond the combat animations themselves. Millennia, in her second phase, screams with something between fury and anguish as she transforms, clearly suffering under the weight of her own rot even as she attacks. Godfrey, in his true form as Hora Lu, roars with what reads as genuine primal grief buried under monstrous rage. The Tarnished hears all of this. The game clearly wants you to hear it. The sound design and vocal performance work is far too deliberate to be incidental, and responds only with continued, uninterrupted violence. There is no mechanic for mercy here, no button for stepping back, no in fiction acknowledgement that the thing screaming in front of you might be suffering in a way that complicates the simple narrative of hero versus monster. The Tarnished processes grief-laden combat screams as damage phase indicators, useful information about attack patterns, nothing more. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how much of the Tarnished's true psychological profile lives not in cutscenes or spoken dialogue, but buried in item descriptions, small blocks of text attached to weapons, armor, and consumables that most players skim past on their way to checking a stat number. And notice that this is, structurally, one of the strangest storytelling choices in the entire game. From Software has always used item-flavored text to deliver lore, but Elden Ring pushes this further than most of its predecessors, burying entire character arcs, entire tragic backstories, entire pieces of the Tarnished's own implied psychology inside 2 or 3 sentences of item flavor that exist beneath an equip button. You can walk past some of the most disturbing implications about the nature of your own quest, implications about who's really pulling the strings, about what the greater will actually is, about how expendable Tarnished have historically been treated by the very forces they serve, without ever reading a single word of it, simply by not opening the menu and hovering over the right item long enough. The game is fully capable of telling you exactly how bleak your situation is. It simply refuses to make you look. That design choice mirrors the Tarnished's own psychology almost perfectly. The horror is always available, always present, sitting one menu tab away, And the vast majority of the time, both the character and the player choose not to look directly at it, preferring instead to focus on the immediate, actionable problem of numbers going up. Let's talk about the name for a second, because it's easy to forget that Tarnished doesn't really have one in any meaningful narrative sense. You choose a name at character creation, sure, but the game itself almost never uses it. NPCs refer to you as Tarnished, a designation, a category, a description of your fallen status rather than an actual identity. Nobody in the lands between calls you by whatever name you typed into that character creation screen. You exist narratively as a type of thing rather than a specific person. One Tarnished among countless others who crossed the sea in response to the shattering, distinguished from the rest only by the fact that you happen to be the one still standing by the credits. There's something quietly devastating buried in that if you actually sit with it. A person stripped of memory, stripped of a name anyone uses, defined entirely by a category, exile, outcast, tarnished, moving through a world of demigods who each get names, titles, personal mythologies, individual identities carved into the setting's history, while you remain, structurally, interchangeable with every other nameless wanderer who happened to answer the same call. And yet this nameless, category-defined figure is the one who ends up reshaping the entire cosmology of the setting by the credits. There's something almost cruel in that structure. The emptiest, most identity-stripped character in the entire cast is precisely the one granted enough power to remake reality. As though identity and power exist in inverse proportion to each other in this world, and the Tarnished's blankness wasn't an obstacle to that power, but the exact precondition for it. If you've played through Shadow of the Erdtree, the game's major expansion, this thesis only sharpens, because the Delci's central figure, Miquella, gives us a demigod who has spent presumably centuries trying to engineer a version of love and compassion so absolute, so surgically perfected, that it strips away pain, doubt, and imperfection entirely. A project that requires him to essentially perform a kind of psychological surgery on Radon's corpse, reviving and repurposing him as a consort stripped of his original will. Miquella's entire arc is a demigod trying to solve trauma by removing the messy, painful parts of consciousness altogether, engineering perfection through subtraction. And the Tarnished, upon encountering the results of this project, a corrupted, screaming, half-remembered Radon fused unnaturally with Miquella's will, responds the way the Tarnished responds to everything, draws a weapon, and fights. There's no room in the moment-to-moment mechanics for the Tarnished to reckon with the fact that they're looking at an extreme, magnified version of exactly the kind of psychological restructuring their own journey has quietly put them through. Trauma processed not through healing, but through radical, forced adaptation, until suffering barely registers as suffering anymore. Miquella tried to engineer that state directly, surgically, onto another person. The lands between, the shattering, the broken rune of death, and hundreds of hours of repeated violence engineered something structurally similar onto the Tarnished, just more slowly, more incidentally, without any single architect designing it on purpose. Messmer deserves a mention here too, because his arc within the Dilk gives us yet another mirror, this time of rejection specifically. Marika's son, hidden away, associated with serpents and fire in ways the setting clearly frames as both a mark of shame and a source of terrible power. Messmer's entire identity was shaped by concealment, kept from the world. Denied a place among the officially sanctioned demigods, his existence itself treated as something to be managed and hidden rather than celebrated. His response to that lifelong rejection is to build an entire crusade, an entire theology of fire and serpents, channeling generations of buried resentment into a holy war waged specifically to reclaim recognition he was denied from birth. And the Tarnished, another figure defined by rejection and exile, another figure whose starting condition is banishment from a golden order that decided they didn't belong, arrives to end Messmer's crusade with a sword rather than a conversation. There's no acknowledgement, mechanically or narratively, that the person swinging that sword is, structurally, addressing their own unresolved history by proxy, cutting down an externalized, monstrous version of the exact wound that defines their own character's origin. If you wanted a single image to summarize the entire thesis of this video, it might be that one, the exile killing another exile's answer to exile, without ever recognizing the shape of what they're actually fighting. So let's ask the question directly, the one this whole video has been circling without quite landing on yet. Why doesn't the Tarnished break? Given everything we've cataloged, the repeated deaths, the compartmentalized grief, the frictionless mass killing, the willingness to take orders from disembodied fingers, the total absence of a stable identity to anchor any of it. The endless mirrors of trauma the game keeps placing in front of them without ever letting the moment land. Why does this character remain, on the surface, functional? Why do they keep walking forward, keep leveling up, keep building relationships they know are doomed, keep choosing among endings that are all in their own way forms of repeating the exact catastrophe that started the story? The honest answer, the one that actually holds up against real psychological frameworks rather than just sounding dramatic, is dissociation. Not in the loose, casual sense people throw the word around in, but in the clinical sense, a mind's capacity to fragment experience, to separate the self performing an action from the self that would normally process the emotional weight of that action, specifically as a survival mechanism when the alternative is total psychological collapse. People who survive extended trauma, combat veterans, survivors of prolonged captivity, people who've endured repeated, inescapable violence frequently describe exactly this kind of functional dissociation, a sense of watching themselves act from a slight remove, a blunting of emotional response that isn't the same as not caring, but is instead the mind's way of making caring survivable by pushing it slightly out of reach. The Tarnished's flat, procedural calm in the face of horror after horror isn't the absence of a psyche. It's what a psyche looks like after it has been forced to build a permanent buffer between itself and everything it's had to do and witness. Because without that buffer, the character, and by extension you playing them, would not be able to continue functioning at all. And that reframes the meta layer one more time, in a direction that's slightly uncomfortable to sit with if you take it seriously. If the Tarnished psychological survival strategy is dissociation, a buffer between the self and the horror of what's happening, then playing Elden Ring for dozens of hours without feeling constant horror isn't just you being a normal, well-adjusted person enjoying a video game the way it's meant to be enjoyed. It's you, structurally, adopting the exact same buffer the character needs to survive their own story. The game doesn't just depict dissociation as a coping mechanism inside the fiction. It requires dissociation as a coping mechanism from you, the person outside the fiction, in order for the game to be playable at all as entertainment, rather than as an unbearable slog through relentless grief and violence. Every design choice that makes death feel light, the elegant animation, the quick reload, the slightly comedic ragdoll physics when you get launched off a cliff, is doing real psychological work, quietly recalibrating your threshold for what counts as a big deal, so that by hour 30, you can watch your character die for the 100th time and feel mild frustration at a boss's moveset, rather than anything resembling the actual weight of repeated death. From Software didn't do this by accident. Every one of these games depends on making violence and death frictionless enough to repeat constantly. Because repetition is the entire mechanical backbone of the genre, you learn a boss by dying to it, over and over, until the pattern becomes automatic. The studio needed you dissociated from death in order for their core gameplay loop to function at all, and the fact that they built a protagonist whose in fiction psychology mirrors that exact requirement isn't a coincidence. It's the game being honest in its own oblique, easy-to-miss way about what it's actually asking of both its main character and the person controlling them. There's a particular irony worth sitting with here, which is that the game's most acclaimed, most narratively significant reveal, the true nature of Radagon and Marika, is itself a story about forced fusion, about identity being split, reshaped, and stitched back together against its own coherence for the sake of maintaining a broken system. Marika, we eventually learn, split herself, becoming both herself and Radagon simultaneously, two identities occupying. Through means the game never fully clarifies, something like the same underlying being forced into that configuration by the demands of maintaining the Golden Order and the Elden Ring stability. Two selves, neither fully separate nor fully unified, both required to keep functioning under the weight of a rule too large for either of them alone. If you want the cleanest possible thematic mirror for the Tarnished's own condition, it's sitting right there at the center of the game's entire cosmology. A being whose sense of self has been split, reshaped, and forced into continued function by circumstances outside their control, propping up a system that arguably should have been allowed to end long ago, because ending it would mean confronting a collapse too total to easily survive. Marika did this to herself, deliberately, as a strategy. The Lands Between, the Shattering, and hundreds of hours of repeated death did something structurally similar to the Tarnished, just without any single deliberate architect behind it. An emergent property of the conditions themselves rather than a conscious choice. And by the end of the game, you are asked to kill the goddess who fractured her own identity to survive her circumstances, using a body and mind that has, by that point, fractured in a quieter, less mythologized way to survive yours. Let's go back to the Greater Will's design choice for a moment. Because I mentioned earlier that Ranni all but confirms the Tarnished's emptiness was functional, and it's worth digging into exactly what kind of functionality that emptiness serves. A being with a strong, intact sense of self, formed relationships, clear values, continuity of memory, is a being that can say no, can hesitate, can weigh a divine directive against personal conviction and decide the directive isn't worth following. The Greater Will, an entity so distant and abstract that even its own most devoted servants describe its will in vague, uncertain terms, needed something that wouldn't do that. It needed instruments, not partners. And amnesia, in that light, isn't just a convenient narrative device for justifying player-driven exploration. It's a deliberate, if cosmic scale, act of psychological engineering, stripping away exactly the components of a mind that would make it resistant to being used. The Tarnished isn't just someone who happens to have forgotten their past. They're someone who was, in effect, selected and processed specifically because forgetting made them more useful. That's a genuinely disturbing premise once you say it plainly, and the game buries it so deep in optional dialogue and item text that most players finish the entire story without ever fully absorbing what it implies about their own character's origin. Multiplayer complicates this picture in an interesting way, because it introduces other Tarnished into your world not as lore page abstractions, but as actual, controlled entities behaving in ways that reveal just how uniformly this psychological profile holds across the community of players engaging with the fiction. Summon signs litter the ground outside major boss arenas, left by other Tarnished offering to be pulled into your world to help, or in the case of invaders, to hunt you down. Watch how casually this economy of temporary alliance and temporary violence functions. A stranger appears, fights alongside you against a shared threat for a few minutes, and then either dies, or the boss falls and they're unceremoniously banished back to their own world. The connection severed instantly, no goodbye, no acknowledgement, nothing carried forward. Or, in the case of an invader, a stranger appears specifically to kill you, and if you kill them first, they simply vanish, defeated, no lasting consequence beyond a brief combat log. There's an entire subculture built around this: invasion builds, gank squads, festival events where dozens of Tarnished gather in a single location purely to duel each other for sport, bowing formally before trying to eviscerate one another with colossal weapons. Every one of these interactions is built on instant, frictionless violence between beings who are within the fiction, identical in kind to the player's own character, other exiles, other death-broken wanderers chasing the same fractured throne, and the tone across the entire community engaging with this content is celebratory. Fun, a beloved, requested feature. That's not a criticism of the players, to be clear. It's a genuinely fun mechanic. But it's also, if you zoom out far enough, an entire ecosystem of amnesiac, resurrection-adapted killers treating casual, consequence-free combat against their own kind as a form of recreation, and the ease with which that framing sits comfortably as fun multiplayer content, rather than deeply unsettling ritualized violence, tells you something about how thoroughly this psychological profile has been normalized, both inside the fiction and in how we talk about the game surrounding it. It's worth pausing to look at the Tarnished from an angle the game almost never grants you directly: the perspective of the ordinary people who aren't demigods, aren't major questline characters, aren't posed as either allies or bosses, but simply exist in the world as background population. Cal, the merchant who greets you near the very start of the game, treats the Tarnished with a wary, careful courtesy, the tone of someone who has learned correctly that a Tarnished wandering into your shop could just as easily rob or kill you as pay for goods, and who has structured an entire business model around not provoking that possibility. Scattered throughout the world are small, easily missed moments of ordinary people reacting to the Tarnished not as a chosen hero, but as an unpredictable, potentially dangerous outsider. Doors that don't open for you until you've proven yourself. Villagers who flee or arm themselves at your approach. Entire settlements that exist behind locked gates specifically because armed wanderers claiming divine purpose have apparently caused enough trouble in the past that caution has become the default posture. The game rarely dwells on this perspective, because dwelling on it would mean acknowledging that from the point of view of the world's actual civilians, the protagonist you're controlling looks less like a savior and more like exactly the kind of roaming, unpredictable, heavily armed figure any sensible person would want nowhere near their home. We don't experience the story that way because we're inside the Tarnished's perspective. following their goals, feeling their momentum toward the throne. But the moment you imagine watching this figure from a farmhouse window instead of from behind their eyes, the entire heroic framing gets a lot harder to hold on to without some discomfort. There's a specific strand of environmental storytelling worth pulling out here too. The sheer number of small, self-contained tragedies scattered across the overworld that have nothing to do with the main quest at all, that exist purely as texture, and that the Tarnished walks past, investigates for loot, and moves on from without any narrative acknowledgement that a tragedy has just been witnessed. A dead mother clutching a dead infant in a collapsed home. A soldier who died defending a post nobody was left to relieve him from. A pair of lovers who chose to end things together rather than face the plague consuming their village. These are not quest critical. They don't advance any storyline. They exist because the environmental artists and writers wanted the world to feel lived in and devastated in equal measure, scattering small human tragedies throughout the map the way other games scatter side quests. And the Tarnished's engagement with these scenes is almost always transactional. Check the corpse for an item, read the nearby message or item description if one exists. Move on toward the next objective. Multiply that by the dozens, maybe hundreds, of similar tableaus scattered across a full playthrough, and you get a character who has walked past an enormous, cumulative weight of small, specific, individually named human grief, absorbing none of it beyond its utility as a loot source, and continuing on with exactly the same forward momentum they had before encountering it. Now, a fair objection at this point, and one worth taking seriously rather than waving off, is that this entire line of reasoning risks overreading a video game protagonist as though they were a real clinical subject, when in fact the blankness of the Tarnished is simply a functional design choice. An empty vessel built so that millions of different players can project their own choices onto it. The same basic design logic behind blank slate protagonists going back decades, from silent player characters in classic RPGs to the deliberately undefined heroes of countless other franchises. Under that reading, there's no deep psychology to excavate here at all, just an absence. A gap in the character sheet left open on purpose, so the fiction doesn't get in the way of player agency. And that reading isn't wrong, exactly. It's true that the Tarnished blankness serves a real, practical design function, and it would be a mistake to claim From Software sat down and deliberately engineered a case study in trauma-induced dissociation as their primary creative goal. But design intent and interpretive weight aren't the same thing, and a choice made for practical reasons can still produce a text that supports a genuinely disturbing reading once you follow its internal logic all the way through. The game gives you an amnesiac killer who dies constantly, kills constantly, takes orders from disembodied divine authority, and shows no lasting sign of psychological strain across any of it. And whether that was designed as blank vessel for player projection or portrait of dissociative adaptation to impossible trauma, the actual on-screen behavior supports both readings simultaneously, because they're not actually in conflict. The blank vessel and the traumatized survivor can be the same shape. That's not a contradiction in the argument. That might be the whole point. There's also a version of the counter-argument that says every video game protagonist behaves this way, that we're describing the standard action game hero archetype rather than something unique to Elden Ring. And there's something to that too. Plenty of games ask their characters to kill thousands of enemies without consequence. Plenty of games treat player death as a mechanical reset rather than a narrative event. But Elden Ring is unusually deliberate about giving all of this an in-fiction explanation rather than leaving it as an unexamined genre convention. Most action games don't bother explaining why the protagonist can die repeatedly and keep functioning. It's simply understood as how games work. A transparent contract between game and player that both sides agree not to interrogate. Elden Ring, through the broken rune of death, through the Tarnished specific status as an exile called back by cosmic compulsion, through the entire theological apparatus of grace and the Erd Tree and the Greater Will, goes out of its way to build an actual explanation for why death doesn't function properly for this specific character. That specificity is what elevates this from generic video game logic to an actual, textually supported psychological premise. The game didn't have to explain why you keep getting back up. It chose to, and the explanation it gave is, when you actually sit with it, considerably darker than most players ever stop to notice. What's genuinely striking, once you start looking for the Tarnished specific brand of blunted, adapted psychology, is how quickly you notice it isn't unique to the Tarnished at all. It's ambient across the entire Lands Between. baked into nearly every character you meet who has survived any meaningful length of time in this world. Patches, the recurring trickster and thief who's appeared across multiple From Software games in slightly different forms, treats betrayal, ambush, and repeated failed attempts on the player's life with the same glib, unbothered tone he'd used to discuss the weather. Because in a world this saturated with violence, treachery has simply become a career rather than a moral event. Bach the Seamster, cursed and disfigured, discusses his own transformation and suffering with a kind of resigned, almost cheerful pragmatism that would read as deeply strange coming from anyone in a less thoroughly traumatized setting. Even Melina, the character closest to functioning as the Tarnished's emotional anchor throughout most of the game, discusses her own eventual immolation with a calm, businesslike clarity that suggests she too has done whatever internal work is necessary to face an inevitable, self-chosen death without visible dread. The entire cast of The Lands Between, major and minor alike, seems to share this same flattened relationship to horror, the same capacity to discuss unthinkable circumstances in matter-of-fact tones. And once you notice that pattern extending across nearly the entire population, rather than being isolated to your specific character, the Tarnished starts to look less like an outlier, and more like a fairly representative product of the world that made them. This isn't one broken person wandering through an otherwise normal setting. It's a broken person moving through a world where everyone left standing has, in some fashion, been broken in a compatible way, which is arguably a far bleaker premise than a single traumatized protagonist ever could be on their own. That ambient quality matters, because it suggests the shattering itself functioned as a kind of mass psychological event, not just a political or metaphysical rupture. When the Elden Ring broke and the Rune of Death scattered, something changed in how this entire world relates to mortality, violence, and meaning. And everyone who survived that change, demigods and peasants and Tarnished alike, had to adapt to it in whatever way their circumstances allowed. Some adapted through madness, chasing frenzied flame or scarlet rot as an answer to a world that stopped making sense. Some adapted through obsessive, narrowed focus, like Radon holding back the stars through pure, stubborn refusal to let go. Some adapted through calculated coldness, like Ranni, who turned grief and rejection into decades of patient scheming. And the Tarnished adapted the way we've spent this entire video cataloging, through a kind of functional blankness, a capacity to absorb horror after horror without visible strain, propelled forward by external compulsion and an emptied-out sense of self that had nothing left to resist that compulsion with. None of these are healthy adaptations by any ordinary standard. They're just the range of things a mind can do when the alternative to adapting is ceasing to function altogether. And Elden Ring, whether by careful design or emergent consequence of building such an unrelentingly bleak setting, ends up populated almost entirely by characters demonstrating one damaged coping strategy or another, with the player's own characters sitting quietly at the center of that pattern rather than outside it. Let's go back to Melina for a moment, specifically to a small mechanical detail easy to treat as pure aesthetic flourish rather than something with real implication. The way she touches the Tarnished at sites of grace, granting levels through a moment of physical contact that the game frames with unusual tenderness for a series not typically interested in tenderness at all. It's one of the few consistent instances of gentle physical touch the Tarnished receives throughout the entire game, bracketed on either side by extraordinary violence. You claw your way through some nightmare, return to a site of grace bleeding and exhausted in whatever way the mechanics represent exhaustion, and receive, in exchange for the runes you've harvested from the dead, a brief moment of quiet contact and rest before heading back out to do it again. There's something worth noticing in how completely this pattern, brutal violence, followed by brief tender contact, followed by more brutal violence, mirrors patterns that show up in real accounts of trauma bonding, where moments of comfort become inextricably tied to cycles of harm. And the comfort itself starts to feel meaningful specifically because of how stark the contrast is against everything surrounding it. The Tarnished isn't just enduring horror, they're forming what looks like genuine attachment to the brief respites carved out of that horror, which is exactly the kind of psychological structure that develops in minds shaped by prolonged, inescapable difficulty, rather than minds that have any real alternative available to them. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the act of resting at a site of grace itself, stripped down to its barest mechanical description, and notice how much it resembles a ritualized act of temporary self-erasure rather than simple rest. Approaching a site of grace refills your flasks, respawns every defeated enemy in the surrounding area except bosses, and effectively resets the Tarnished's immediate environment to a kind of default state, as though the intervening violence, exploration, and death never quite happened in any lasting sense. You kneel, briefly, at these golden points of light, and the world around you quietly reorganizes itself back toward its baseline condition. There's a strange, almost meditative violence tucked inside that mechanic, if you think about it as something other than a checkpoint system. A character who periodically kneels at these small shrines, and in doing so, allows the surrounding landscape's accumulated damage to partially reset, as though resting itself has become entangled with a kind of willed forgetting, a structural echo of the deeper amnesia that defines the Tarnished's entire existence. You forget your past before the story even begins. You forget, in miniature, every area you've cleared each time you kneel to rest. Forgetting isn't just your character's backstory. It's baked into the rhythm of how you're meant to interact with the world moment to moment, over and over, for the entire length of the game. The consecrated snowfield, buried in the game's late-game optional content, offers one of the clearer visual encapsulations of everything we've been discussing, and it's worth pulling apart because so few players spend real time with it. A frozen, buried wasteland concealing the remnants of an entire people wiped out by holy warfare, its true horrors hidden literally beneath the visible snow, accessible only through a specific, easily missed mechanism most players never trigger without a guide. The Tarnished journey through it involves uncovering, quite literally excavating, atrocity after atrocity that the surface world has simply buried and moved past, mass graves, ruined settlements, entire theological conflicts that ended in near total extermination, all sitting quietly under an untouched blanket of snow that most travelers would cross without ever suspecting what lies beneath. That's a strong image for the Tarnished's own psychology, whether or not it was consciously designed as one. A calm, undisturbed surface concealing enormous, unprocessed catastrophe just beneath it, requiring a very specific and deliberate act to uncover. Most players never find the door beneath the snow. Most players, similarly, never sit with the full weight of what their character has actually been through by the credits. Because the surface presentation, competent, driven, quietly heroic, is so thoroughly maintained by the game's pacing and tone that the buried material stays buried unless you go looking for it on purpose. Let's return one more time to how the Tarnished handles losing companions specifically, because there's an asymmetry worth naming clearly. When Melina departs, whether burned to light the Erd Tree, or lost through one of the game's alternate paths where her fate diverges, the game offers almost no mechanical space for the Tarnished to grieve. No cutscene of mourning, no altered dialogue reflecting loss, no change to how your character moves through the world afterward. The narrative simply proceeds, level progression continues through other means, and the game's pacing barely acknowledges that anything has changed. Compare that to how other characters in the setting are shown processing loss, Millennia's grief for her brother woven into her entire fighting style and dialogue, Mesmer's rage sustained across presumably decades by the wound of his exile. Rainey's entire arc a patient, cold-burning response to grief and rejection stretched across a scheme that spans generations. Nearly every other significant figure in the Lands Between processes lost through some visible, sustained behavioral response. The Tarnished, having lost arguably their closest companion, processes it by continuing to explore, continuing to fight, continuing to level up, with no observable behavioral shift whatsoever. That absence of visible grief isn't the game forgetting to write a reaction. It's consistent with everything else we've cataloged, a mind so thoroughly adapted to loss, so practiced at compartmentalizing it, that even the loss of the single relationship the game spent the most time building doesn't produce a crack in the surface wide enough for the story to bother depicting. It's worth stepping outside the fiction one more time and asking why exactly. So many people find this particular psychological structure so deeply satisfying to inhabit for dozens or hundreds of hours, because that question matters just as much as anything happening inside the game's own lore. Hidetaka Miyazaki, the director behind this entire lineage of games, has spoken in interviews over the years about designing difficulty specifically as a vehicle for a very particular emotional arc, repeated failure building toward eventual mastery, frustration curdling into determination, death becoming not a punishment but a teacher. That design philosophy, taken on its own terms, is genuinely compelling, and it's a large part of why these games have earned the devoted following they have. But it's worth noticing that the exact mechanism producing that satisfying arc of mastery, repeated death treated as low stakes, iterative, almost administrative. is the same mechanism we've spent this entire video identifying as psychologically alarming when you imagine it happening to an actual person, rather than a player learning a boss's moveset. The thing that makes these games rewarding to play and the thing that makes the Tarnished psychology so unsettling to examine closely are structurally the exact same design choice, viewed from two different angles. From inside the fiction, endless death without lasting consequence reads as trauma without adequate processing. From outside the fiction, sitting on your couch with a controller in your hands, that same endless death without lasting consequence reads as one of the most satisfying gameplay loops ever built. Both readings are true simultaneously, and the game doesn't ask you to reconcile them. It just lets you enjoy the loop, while the darker implication sits quietly underneath, available to anyone willing to actually look for it, ignored by everyone who'd rather just get past this next boss. There's something worth saying plainly here about why that dual nature might actually be the deepest part of the design rather than an accidental byproduct of it. Games about mastering difficulty through repetition are, in some sense, always going to flirt with this exact problem, because mastery requires repetition, and repetition requires low-stakes failure. And low-stakes failure requires some fictional or mechanical justification for why failure doesn't actually cost anything permanent. Elden Ring didn't invent that tension. What it did was build one of the most thorough, most textually supported fictional justifications for that tension that the genre has ever produced, wrapping the entire structure in a coherent mythology about broken death. Divine manipulation, an identity stripped down to nothing, rather than leaving the tension unexamined the way most action games do. Whether that was Miyazaki and his team consciously building a psychological character study, or simply building the best possible fictional scaffolding to support their preferred difficulty philosophy, the end result is a protagonist whose behavior, examined closely and without the comfortable distance most players maintain from it, reads as one of the more thorough portraits of trauma-adapted dissociation that mainstream gaming has ever produced, entirely by way of a character most people would describe, without a second thought, as simply cool or badass or the chosen one. Go back to the very beginning of the game for a moment, because it's worth re-examining that opening sequence with everything we now know layered on top of it. The Tarnished awakens in a cave, no memory, no context, guided almost immediately toward death. The first proper enemy encounter in most players' experience is designed to kill you, deliberately. A soft tutorial in the game's core lesson that death here doesn't mean what death is supposed to mean. Before you've even left the tutorial area, before the game has given you a single line of meaningful dialogue about who you are or what you're meant to do, it has already taught you the single most important behavioral lesson governing everything we've discussed for the past 2 hours. Dying is fine. Get up. Keep going. That lesson lands so early, so casually, so completely without ceremony, that most players don't even register it as a lesson at all. It just feels like normal game onboarding, the standard practice of teaching mechanics through failure. But it's also, quite literally, the first thing this broken, memory-erased, exiled figure learns upon waking into their new existence. That death no longer carries the weight it once did, and the correct, expected response to dying is simply to continue. Everything that follows for the next 100+ hours is in a sense that opening lesson playing out at increasing scale, across increasingly monstrous encounters, until it's so thoroughly internalized by both character and player that neither one thinks to question it anymore. The Crucible Knights and the various beast clergy scattered throughout the world offer one more angle worth touching on before we move toward closing this out, because they represent an entire faction built around voluntary bodily transformation in pursuit of power, fusing themselves with animal features and grotesque augmentations as an act of religious devotion rather than a punishment or curse. Unlike Godric's desperate, ugly grafting, the Crucible Knights' transformation is framed as noble, ancient, a return to some primal form of strength predating the Golden Order's more sanitized rule. And the Tarnished, once again, responds to all of this the same way they respond to everything: draws steel, fights, moves on. But it's worth noticing, one final time, how many of these encounters throughout the game present some version of a being who has deliberately, willingly, reshaped their own body or mind in extreme ways to survive or to gain power in an impossible world, and how the Tarnished's own arc, absorbing great runes, drinking maiden's tears, submitting to whatever transformation each ending requires, sits comfortably alongside all of them, rather than standing apart as some uniquely sane outlier moving through a cast of monsters. By the time the credits roll, however they roll for you specifically, the Tarnished has become one more entry in this world's long catalog of beings who reshaped themselves past the point of easy recognition in order to keep functioning inside conditions that should have broken anyone. So what does crazier than you think actually mean? Once you've walked all the way through everything this video has laid out, it doesn't mean the Tarnished is secretly a villain wearing a hero's mask, and it doesn't mean the game is quietly telling you that your character is evil and you simply failed to notice. That reading is too clean, too easily dismissed, and honestly beneath what the game is actually doing. What it means is something closer to this. The Tarnished is a portrait of what survival looks like, when survival requires abandoning nearly every psychological structure a normal person relies on to stay recognizably themselves. No stable memory, no continuous identity, no lasting emotional response to death, whether their own or anyone else's. No hesitation in the face of authority, however grotesque that authority's form. No accumulating horror despite an accumulating body count that should, by any reasonable standard, have produced horror many hundreds of times over. That's not evil. Evil implies intact judgment being deliberately misused. This is closer to the absence of the very apparatus that judgment requires to function normally in the first place, replaced by something leaner, colder, and far more efficient at simply continuing forward regardless of what continuing forward costs. And the genuinely unsettling part, the part that makes this more than just an interesting lore exercise, is how thoroughly the game gets you to inhabit that same structure without ever telling you it's happening. You don't read a warning at the start of the game explaining that you're about to spend 60, 80, 150 hours slowly acquiring a taste for repeated death, frictionless violence, and compartmentalized grief. It just happens, gradually, one boss attempt at a time, one grinding session at a time, one abandoned NPC storyline at a time, until by the credits you've fully absorbed the exact psychological posture the Tarnished needed to survive their own story. And you've absorbed it so gradually that at no point did it ever feel like something worth questioning. That's not a criticism of the game, and it's not a criticism of anyone who's played it and loved it, myself very much included. It might be the single most impressive piece of long-form psychological craft in the entire From Software catalog, a game that teaches you, through pure repetition and pacing, to feel exactly what its protagonist would have to feel in order to survive their own existence, without ever having to say a single word about it out loud. There's still more ground worth covering here, because so far this video has treated the Tarnished as a singular case, and it's worth widening the lens to look at what the game shows us about Tarnished who didn't survive the process the way your character did, the ones who broke, fully and visibly, rather than adapting into functional blankness. Finger creepers, those unsettling spider-like hand creatures that scuttle across ceilings and ambush travelers in caves and ruins throughout the lands between, are implied through scattered item text and visual design to be connected to failed attempts at communion with the two fingers, twisted remnants of the same spiritual apparatus that speaks to the Tarnished from within its jar. Some interpretations tie them more directly to corrupted extensions of that same grace-touched authority gone wrong. Whatever the precise mechanism the game gives us, scattered throughout its dungeons, physical evidence of what happens when the process that shaped the Tarnished goes further wrong than it went for you, creatures reduced to scuttling, hand-shaped horrors with no remaining trace of coherent personhood at all. The Tarnished you're playing is the version of this process that didn't collapse into that, not because your character was stronger or more virtuous or more deserving. As far as the text tells us, simply because the process landed differently, the way trauma lands differently across different people exposed to structurally similar circumstances, for reasons that often have less to do with character and more to do with luck, timing, and factors nobody involved gets to choose. The Fell Omens deserve their own moment here too, because they represent a specific, visible category of rejection built directly into the game's cosmology. Beings born with horns, marked from birth as omens, hidden away by families ashamed of what they represent, occasionally killed outright in infancy to prevent the shame of their existence from becoming known. Morgott and Mog, both born as Omen despite their status as demigods, carry this rejection as a foundational wound shaping everything that follows in their respective stories. Morgott hiding his horns beneath a crown, ruling in secret shame atop a throne he has to disguise himself to sit on. Mog embracing the rejection fully, building an entire underground kingdom in a twisted devotion to Maquella out of the wound of being unwanted from birth. The Tarnished, remember, begins the game as an exile too, cast out, though through different mechanisms, denied belonging in the lands between until circumstance called them back. There's a through line running underneath this entire setting, connecting nearly every major figure to some version of birth rejection or exile rejection. As though the lands between itself runs on a kind of engine built from discarded, unwanted beings eventually clawing their way back toward relevance through violence. The Tarnished isn't an exception to that engine. They're its most successful product, the discarded thing that through sheer repetition and an emptied out capacity for horror, managed to out-survive every other discarded thing standing in the way of the throne. No discussion of how far this psychology can be pushed would be complete without the Dung Eater, one of the more genuinely disturbing optional storylines the game offers, and one worth examining specifically because it shows the Tarnished actively choosing to participate in something monstrous, rather than simply enduring monstrosity that's been thrust upon them. The Dung Eater is a self-described murderer, imprisoned for atrocities the game only gestures toward rather than states outright, whose entire questline revolves around collecting seed beds of the Fell Omen curse from murdered NPCs and delivering them to him so he can complete a ritual meant to curse the entire population of the lands between, with a fate he considers a kind of grotesque. Eternal imprisonment for the soul. Pursuing his questline to completion means the Tarnished must actively seek out and kill specific named NPCs, some of them innocent, some of them simply going about lives entirely disconnected from the main quest, purely to advance a stranger's plan for mass spiritual torment. And a real percentage of players do pursue this questline, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes for achievement completion, sometimes because the game's design rewards thorough exploration of every optional thread it offers. The fact that this content exists, and the fact that it's engaged with as casually as any other side quest by a meaningful portion of the player base, is maybe the single clearest piece of evidence that the psychological structure we've spent this video describing isn't just something imposed on the Tarnished by circumstance. Sometimes it's a structure the Tarnished, and by extension the player controlling them, actively opts into, seeking out cruelty for its own sake, or for the sake of seeing where an optional narrative thread leads, with the same flat procedural engagement applied to everything else in this world. It would be unfair to end this particular thread without acknowledging the moments the game deliberately carves out as counterweight, because they exist, and they matter, and pretending otherwise would flatten the argument into something less honest than it should be. Iron Fist Alexander, the Wandering Pot Warrior, offers some of the game's warmest, most purely encouraging dialogue, cheering the Tarnished on with genuine, uncomplicated enthusiasm every time their paths cross. Bach's eventual arc, if guided carefully, can end in something resembling redemption and peace rather than tragedy. Certain NPC storylines, if attended to with real care and correct timing, resolve in ways that read as gentle, even hopeful, against the overwhelming backdrop of everything else. The game does allow for kindness. It does allow for small, genuine warmth carved out of an otherwise merciless world. But it's worth noticing that even these pockets of warmth exist entirely at the discretion of the Tarnished's attention and timing. They're optional, missable, easy to walk past entirely if you're focused on the main through line, the way most players are on a first playthrough. The capacity for tenderness is present in this world, and even in this character. It's just buried under so much procedural violence and compartmentalized loss that most players never fully register how much of it exists, or how much of it depends on choices that are easy to simply never make. There's a small, almost throwaway detail worth returning to before we close this out properly, and it's the whistle. The Tarnished summons Torrent through a spectral whistle, a small ritual gesture that produces, out of nothing, a half-real horse from wherever spectral horses go when they're not being ridden. It's such a minor piece of interaction design that most players never think about it as anything other than a summon button. But there's something worth noticing in how completely the Tarnished has normalized calling creatures back from wherever the dead or the not quite alive go, casually on demand dozens of times an hour, without any of the reverence or dread that summoning something from beyond death's normal boundary would presumably warrant in a mind still operating under ordinary human expectations about mortality. The whistle is small, it's almost nothing, but it's one more piece of evidence, stacked among dozens of others across this video, that the entire fabric of how death and return function for this character has been rewired so thoroughly that even a horse being called back from spectral non-existence barely registers as a notable event, mechanically represented by nothing more dramatic than a short musical cue and a horse trotting into frame. Let's go back, one final time, to the burning of the Erd Tree, because it deserves to be looked at again now that everything else in this video has had room to accumulate. Picture the actual sequence of events, stripped of the game's admittedly gorgeous cinematic presentation. A companion who has traveled alongside you for the entire game, who has empowered your growth at every site of grace, who has expressed something that reads, across dozens of hours of small interactions, as genuine care for your well-being, asks you, near the end of everything, to burn her body as fuel for an act of cosmic arson against the closest thing this world has to a symbol of continued life and order. And the Tarnished does it. Whether the game frames this as her choice, her agency, her willing sacrifice for a cause she believes in, and it does frame it that way. Carefully, generously, the actual physical act being performed is still the Tarnished setting fire to someone they've spent the entire game growing close to, watching them burn. And then continuing on toward whatever ending comes next without the story granting a single moment of visible aftermath. No lingering shot of grief, no altered demeanor and subsequent encounters. The credits for most endings arrive shortly after, and the world moves on as though the flame that just consumed your closest companion was simply the next objective marker on the map, completed and left behind. There's a version of this entire video that could have been made about almost any long-running action or role-playing protagonist, and it's worth being honest about that, rather than pretending the Tarnished is uniquely damned among fictional heroes. Plenty of protagonists across plenty of franchises kill in bulk, survive impossible violence, and carry on largely unbothered by the accumulated weight of what they've done, because that's simply how the medium has historically operated, going back decades before Elden Ring or even Dark Souls existed. What makes the Tarnished worth this much attention isn't that they're doing something no other game character has done. It's that Elden Ring, almost uniquely among its peers, gives you the actual textual and mechanical apparatus to explain why none of this seems to touch your character the way it should, and then trusts you either to never look closely enough to notice, or to look closely and find something genuinely worth sitting with once you do. Most games that ask you to kill thousands of enemies simply don't bother justifying the psychological plausibility of a character who can do that and remain, by any conventional measure, sane. Elden Ring built out an entire cosmology specifically capable of answering that question, and the answer it offers, when you actually assemble all its pieces, isn't comforting. Think, for a moment, about what it would mean for someone to describe your own life the way we've just spent close to 3 hours describing the Tarnished. Died repeatedly, remembered every instance clearly, and kept walking forward regardless. Killed without hesitation, across every category of living thing the world offered up. Took spiritual direction from an entity most reasonable people would find genuinely horrifying to look at, let alone obey. Formed real attachments to people whose eventual suffering or death was disclosed in advance, and proceeded anyway. Absorbed the power of everyone they defeated directly into their own body, growing stronger through a process indistinguishable, structurally, from the grotesque transformations the game asks you to be horrified by in its villains. Walked past atrocity after atrocity, tragedy after tragedy, checking each one briefly for useful items before moving on. Chose, at the end of all of it, between becoming the enforcer of a system that had already failed once, embracing total apocalyptic madness, or serving as the instrument of someone else's decades-long scheme, and experienced that choice as a triumphant, meaningful climax, rather than a set of uniformly grim options. No single detail in that description is enough on its own to build a case. Stacked together, cataloged carefully, given the full runtime of a proper sitting to accumulate the way it accumulates across an actual playthrough, it becomes something genuinely difficult to read as simple heroism, however much the framing, the music, the lighting, and the game's own marketing insist otherwise. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the various guardian figures scattered throughout the lands between, whose entire existence has been reduced to standing watch over a single tomb, a single treasure, a single sealed door. Sometimes for what the lore implies has been centuries. And notice that the Tarnished treats these figures as simple obstacles, rather than as beings who represent a far more extreme, far more static version of the same core condition the Tarnished themselves is living through. The Mausoleum Knights guarding Renala's memories, the Fire Giant maintaining his post at the base of the Forge of the Giants, countless nameless sentinels positioned at doorways and treasure rooms across the map. These are beings whose entire remaining function has narrowed down to a single repeated task, performed without end, without relief, without any apparent hope of the task ever concluding except through their own defeat. That's not so different from what the Tarnished's own existence has narrowed down to by the midpoint of most playthroughs. Die, return, fight, level, repeat, chasing an ending that keeps receding further into an ever larger map full of ever larger threats. The Guardians are simply a more extreme, more visibly frozen version of the loop the Tarnished is already living inside. The game asks you to end their loops with a blade. It never asks you to notice that yours hasn't ended either. It's simply still moving, still generating new content to loop through, rather than having settled the way theirs has, into visible stillness. There's a specific quiet cruelty tucked into how thoroughly the game frames every demigod's defeat as necessary, as correct, as the obvious next step toward restoring some kind of order to a broken world, without ever quite letting the Tarnished, or the player, sit with the fact that most of these demigods were themselves victims of the exact same broken systems the Tarnished is nominally trying to fix. Rykard, transformed into a monstrous serpent by his own hunger for godhood, was still before that transformation. A prince denied his birthright by a mother's favoritism toward other children. Godric, mocked and diminished, driven to grotesque grafting by desperation to prove his worth against demigod siblings, who eclipsed him effortlessly. Even Radagon, revealed as one half of Marika herself, was arguably a victim of his own fractured existence, long before the Tarnished ever draws a weapon against him. The game asks you to kill each of these figures as though killing them constitutes justice, or progress, or the correction of some cosmic wrong, while quietly, through its item text and environmental storytelling, revealing that nearly every one of them was themselves shaped by rejection, favoritism, and impossible expectation, in ways that mirror the Tarnished's own origin story far more closely than the triumphant boss kill music ever lets you notice in the moment. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how the game handles the very concept of grace itself. And notice that grace, the guiding gold light that leads you from side of grace to side of grace, that marks you as one of the chosen able to attempt the throne at all, is never once explained as something the Tarnished earned through virtue, wisdom, or moral standing. It's simply granted, arbitrarily, by a greater will whose motivations remain, even after the credits, only partially understood. You are not favored because you're good. You're favored because some vast, distant intelligence selected you as a useful instrument, for reasons that have far more to do with your usefully empty psychological state than with any quality resembling heroism. That arbitrary selection sits underneath the entire journey like a foundation nobody examines closely enough. Every triumph, every defeated demigod, every reclaimed rune, all of it flows from a starting condition of being chosen by something that needed exactly the kind of blankness we've spent this video cataloging, and needed it specifically because blankness doesn't ask uncomfortable questions about the task it's been assigned. It's worth sitting, finally, with how the game's ending sequences are shot and scored, because the craft on display there is doing an enormous amount of quiet work to keep the horror we've been discussing at arm's length from most players' actual emotional experience. Sweeping orchestral swells, slow, reverent camera movement, golden light, warm color grading, a sense of arrival and resolution baked into every visual choice. None of these choices are accidental, and none of them are wrong exactly. They're simply doing exactly what triumphant fantasy endings are supposed to do, giving the player a sense of earned catharsis after dozens of hours of difficulty. But strip the music away, strip the lighting away. Describe, in flat prose, what's actually happening on screen during most of these endings. A memory-erased exile, having killed thousands, having burned a companion, having taken counsel from severed fingers, ascending to godhood or embracing apocalyptic madness, or becoming the enforcer of someone else's decades-long plan. And the disconnect between the emotional register the game wants you to feel and the actual content of what you're witnessing becomes almost impossible to ignore. The swelling music isn't lying to you exactly. It's just doing what music always does in these moments, telling you how to feel about something before you've had a chance to think about whether that feeling is actually earned by what you just did to get there. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how little agency the Tarnished actually has, buried underneath the illusion of choice the game works so hard to give you. And notice that even the most consequential feeling decisions in the entire experience are, in a sense, all pre-authored paths laid down by the greater will, by Marika's original shattering, by demigods and schemers who set their plans in motion long before you ever stepped foot in Limgrave. You can choose which ending to pursue, which factions to help, which NPCs to save or abandon. And the game genuinely does branch meaningfully based on those choices. But the fundamental shape of the journey, become powerful enough to reach the capital, kill enough demigods to matter, choose among a menu of outcomes someone else designed the parameters for, was never actually up for negotiation. The Tarnished's freedom, examined closely, looks a lot like the freedom of someone selecting from a fixed set of options handed to them by forces vastly beyond their control or understanding, dressed up with enough branching paths and alternate outcomes to feel like genuine agency. That's not a flaw in the game's design. If anything, it might be one of its most honest touches. A character whose entire arc is built around choosing among outcomes engineered by someone else, mirroring exactly the condition of a being selected, specifically for their lack of resistance to being used this way in the first place. If you've made it this far, you've spent close to 3 hours sitting with a character most people finish this game without ever examining this closely. And it's worth asking, honestly, what to do with all of this now that it's been laid out in full. Not to feel guilty about enjoying the game, that would be a strange, disproportionate response to a piece of fiction, however dark its implications run once you dig into them. Not to stop playing, or to feel like your 100 hours in the lands between were somehow morally compromised by everything we've cataloged here. The point isn't guilt. The point is closer to recognition, noticing that the thing you've been controlling, the thing you've spent so many hours becoming intimately, muscularly familiar with, was never quite the blank, neutral vessel it first appeared to be. It was always something stranger, something built, deliberately or not, out of exile and amnesia and repeated death and an emptied-out capacity for horror, wearing the armor of a hero because the armor of a hero was the only shape available for a being this broken to move forward in it all. Another quiet detail appears when you look at what happens after the credits actually roll, and notice that the game gives you almost nothing here either. No epilogue text scrolling past explaining what became of the world, no narrated coda summarizing the fate of the lands between under your new order, whatever that order turned out to be. Just a brief cinematic, a title card, and then you're returned to the title screen, or offered New Game Plus, or left simply staring at a static image while the credits themselves run their course. The game that spent so much effort building an intricate layered mythology around exile, madness, and adaptation offers you almost no closure about what your character's choices actually meant for anyone left living in that world once the story stops watching them. That absence of epilogue isn't laziness, it's consistent, one final time. With everything the Tarnished has been across the entire runtime, a figure who acts decisively and often catastrophically, and then simply moves on, without the narrative machinery ever forcing a reckoning with the consequences trailing behind them. The world doesn't get to tell you what your character's crusade actually cost it. It just goes dark, and the next prompt on screen asks if you'd like to do it all again. There's one more thing worth saying before we let this go, and it's about what happens the moment you close the game and step away from the controller, because that transition deserves at least as much scrutiny as anything happening inside the fiction. You, unlike the Tarnished, do get to walk away. You get to close the application, set down the controller, return to a life with continuity, with memory, with relationships that don't end in immolation or abandonment, with a version of yourself that doesn't reset at every checkpoint. That capacity for genuine closure, genuine continuity, genuine unbroken selfhood, the very things the Tarnished never had access to for a single moment of their entire fictional existence, is the whole reason any of this works as entertainment rather than as something closer to actual horror. You can spend 3 hours, or 300, inhabiting a mind this thoroughly reshaped by impossible circumstance, precisely because you know the entire time that you're not actually that mind. The Tarnished never gets that reassurance. The Tarnished only ever has the loop, the fog gate, the whistle calling Torrent back from wherever spectral horses go. And another quiet detail appears when you look at how completely that loop has replaced anything resembling an interior life, and notice that maybe the loop was always the whole point. Not a bug in the story From Software wanted to tell, but the exact shape of the story itself. Told patiently, for as long as you were willing to keep pressing forward. Go back through your own memory of the game if you've played it, and try to find the moment your character actually stopped and felt something all the way through, without immediately moving on to the next objective, the next fog gate, the next opportunity to level up or explore or grind. It's genuinely difficult to locate. Not because the game never offers the opportunity, it offers dozens of them, scattered through quiet dialogue, through Melina's small moments of tenderness, through the rare NPC who asks for nothing more than to be listened to for a few lines of text. It's difficult to locate because the pacing of the entire experience is built around forward motion, and forward motion sustained long enough. becomes its own kind of psychology, one that doesn't leave much room for anything to actually land before the next thing arrives to replace it. That forward motion is thrilling. It's part of why these games are so compulsively playable, why just one more boss turns into another 6 hours before you notice the sun's come up. But it's also, structurally, the exact same mechanism that would produce the flattened, dissociated affect we've spent this entire video describing in a real person subjected to the equivalent circumstances. The thrill and the damage are not separate things happening side by side. They're the same motion, viewed from two different distances. Somewhere in the lands between right now, in whatever save file you left running, the Tarnished is standing at a site of grace, or riding across the Altus Plateau, or kneeling before a jar of fingers waiting for the next instruction, exactly as calm as they were the moment you first picked up the controller, carrying inside them everything we've spent this video pulling apart piece by piece, and carrying none of it visibly, because visibility was never really the point. The Tarnished doesn't know they're a case study. They don't know their own psychology has a shape worth naming, worth mapping against real accounts of trauma and adaptation and forced dissociation. They just know the next fog gate, and the flask at their hip and the horse that comes when called. And whatever fragment of purpose the jar of fingers has assigned them this time, and they will keep walking toward it, calmly, competently, endlessly, for as long as someone somewhere keeps pressing the button that tells them to continue. Think back to the very first site of grace you ever knelt at, in the tutorial cave, before you knew any of what this world would eventually ask of you. You had no idea, in that moment, what you were agreeing to by continuing forward. Neither did the Tarnished, stripped of memory, given no context beyond a vague pull toward a throne they couldn't have named a reason for wanting. Both of you walked forward anyway, out of the cave, into daylight, toward Limgrave's golden fields and everything waiting beneath their surface. That's not naivety exactly, on either side. It's closer to the only available response when the alternative, turning back, refusing the call, remaining in the dark of that opening cave forever, was never really presented as an option worth taking seriously. The game doesn't let you stay in the tutorial. The Greater Will doesn't let the Tarnished stay in ordinary exile, forgotten across the sea. Spared the entire catastrophe that follows. Something always pulls forward. Something always insists that continuing is the only reasonable response to whatever comes next, and by the time either of you might have paused to ask whether continuing was actually the right choice, you were already too far in, too adapted, too thoroughly reshaped by everything the journey had already asked of you, to meaningfully consider turning back. Consider, too, how many players, genuinely dedicated, thoughtful players, who've spent hundreds of hours across multiple characters mastering every corner of this game, could probably not tell you, off the top of their head, the exact wording of the Two Fingers' first message, or the specific mechanism by which the Rune of Death came to be shattered, or what Ranni actually implies about why the Tarnished were chosen at all. Not because those players weren't paying attention, because the game buries its darkest implications so deep beneath its combat, its exploration, its sheer moment-to-moment mechanical pleasure, that absorbing the full weight of what the Tarnished actually is requires a kind of deliberate, patient excavation most players never have reason to undertake. You finish the game. You watch an ending. You feel genuinely a sense of triumph, of earned completion, of having overcome something difficult and meaningful. And underneath all of that, quietly, unexamined, sits everything this video has spent 3 hours laying out piece by piece, a portrait of adaptation so complete, so thorough, that it stopped looking like damage and started looking, instead, like the shape of a hero.